Welcome to the new Ancient Civilization series. I have decided that the next geographical area we're going to cover will be Ancient Greece. And when I mean Ancient Greece, I don't just mean Greece, I mean Magna Graecia. In this series I will talk about the main Greek states and colonies around Europe and their role throughout history. There will be two I won't talk about though, Syracuse and Taras, because I already covered them both in the Italian series. It may be too late to ask, but if you have any suggestions of topics, feel free to comment them down below. I will let you know if the topic you chose is already in the other dozen of episodes I planned. We have a very special guest today, my uni professor Giovanni Giorgini. He has something to add in regards to what I'm about to explain, so be sure to watch all the way through. Now let's get on with the intro. Now, as some of you know, there were three main types of Greeks, but other than the language, they mostly share the same culture, and unlike many other civilizations we have covered before, there is a lot to say about their costumes, religion, way of life, etc. Out of all ancient Western civilizations, what stands out the most about Greece is their writing, particularly the field of science, math, and philosophy. Therefore, I intend to start this series by talking about the classical authors that inspired me to begin this series in the first place. Political philosophy, as we know it today, was born in ancient Greece, mostly in archaic and classical times. During these time periods, the Mediterranean Sea had become a safer place to sail around in. Trade became more of a possibility, and many merchants took this opportunity to sail around, bringing new goods and ideas from other lands. It was during this time that Greeks developed their new alphabet, which was heavily based on the Phoenician one. It was then when the traditional beliefs of the Greeks mutated with foreign influences. Sophists and philosophers argued over this new perspective for centuries, leading to the first instances of political debates. They shaped Greek culture through debates and creativity. One of the first and arguably most important debates they had to wrap their heads around was to answer the question, what's more important to follow, the will of the law or the will of the gods? Hence, who should rule us, social guidelines or the fear of the afterlife? On a similar note, Greek sophists and philosophers often wondered for the right definition for justice. Gorgias, one of the first philosophers we know of, arrived in Athens from Sicily to study Athenian courts. He realized that the verdict of a trial is not always accurate, as in not an accurate reflection of the events, but just the version with more known facts that support it, hence concluding that what we call truth is a series of facts and evidence, which is most appealing and persuasive to us. That's why many of us believe different things, and that often people say truth is subjective. The history of political thought is composed of a series of authors who have tried to answer the question of what the best form of government is. The metric they used was happiness. Therefore, the government that made the people the happiest is without a doubt the best government. Aristotle put a lot of emphasis on happiness, but we won't talk about him today. Today also we put a lot of emphasis on happiness. Think of the World Happiness Index. There are, however, many other things to factor in modern age, such as culture and wealth. Tuffy too made a very good video about it a while back, but let's not get sidetracked. Herodotus was the first to write about a debate where three people argued over such topic. All bring up interesting arguments. The debaters were Emperor Darius of Persia and two of his generals, who wanted a democracy or an oligarchy. Darius supported a monarchy, and as you might guess, he won. These were their arguments. The monarchy is efficient and balanced, but leads to inequality. The oligarchy gives the power to the aristocracy, the ones most fit to rule, but these rulers are power hungry, and civil war and disunity is very likely. The democracy gives power to the people, hence the majority, but the masses are not fit to rule, therefore the community will easily decay. Just like truth, the best choice of government also appears to be subjective, and most Greeks at the time actually supported a monarchy, such as Plato and Aristotle. Speaking of Plato, he was one of the most important writers in ancient history. In his book series The Republic, he writes down imaginary dialogues where people discuss things, bringing bringing up a lot of different perspectives. In his very first chapter, there is a debate about justice, involving Socrates, a man named Cephalus, his son Polemarcho, a sophist named Thrasymachus, and two of Plato's cousins. Many think that Plato's thoughts are the same as Socrates, another philosopher that used to exist but did not write any of his work down. Socrates is seen by many as the main character but is not always present, so it is unlikely that Plato really agrees fully with any of the characters. Personally, I think he just wants to bring up these debates and let people make their own mind. He never builds a straw man. Everyone there has pretty solid arguments. This makes it feel very real and intriguing. I don't plan to get too much into it, but to cut it short, there are two main perspectives on a state. First one is the predatory perspective. It sees justice as an act of force, or the useful of the strong. The other one is the contractual perspective, which sees justice as a social contract between the people and the state, who give up some of their rights in exchange for citizenship and protection. The debate between predatory and contractual perspectives will be a philosophical discussion that would last for centuries to come. However, Socrates and probably Plato's theory is something different. He thinks that people are divided into three parts: the one seeking material goods, the second seeking abstract goods such as glory and fame, and the one seeking knowledge. He thinks that to be fair and just, a man has to appeal to the rationality within him or herself and embrace knowledge. Therefore, he thinks that only philosophers are the ones fit to rule and to be our judges, because they have dedicated their whole lives on seeking objective truths. He explains further why he believes so at the beginning of Book 7 of the Republic. Socrates tells the myth of the cave. Men live in a cave and know the outside world only through the shadows that are reflected on its walls. The shadows may seem real, perhaps through appearance, but they are just small fragments of the bigger picture. The philosopher is the one who climbs out of the cave and sees the real world, being amazed by everything he finds. Plato, unlike Gorgias and Herodotus, believes that there is an objective truth about the most important things that concern human beings, and therefore, philosophers, the ones willing to spend their whole lives searching for it, are the only ones deserving to rule. By observing the work of animal breeders, Plato developed the theory that philosophers had to manipulate relationships between citizens so they could have children capable of understanding justice, hence some form of genetic engineering. In the history of Western political thought, Plato is the first to propose an ideal form of government. The perfect city is like an organism in which all organs fulfill their duty to make it work. The disease is represented by the civil war. The requirements for such government should be 1. Power to the philosophers, 2. Equity between men and women, and communitarianism. Within the Platonic ideal state, all citizens are happy because they are educated and are taught by philosophers to appreciate knowledge and wisdom. Everybody is placed on a position in society most compatible with his skills. Plato calls this city Callipolis. However, since even the perfect city was built by humans who are imperfect, it will eventually fall into tyranny and decay. Plato even details the process in which Callipolis will decay. Philosophers, first of all, will make a mistake when coupling their citizens, leading to the creation of people driven by power and not knowledge. These people will take over eventually and build a democracy, hence a government led by philosophers who put knowledge aside in exchange for material goods, who they think will grant them happiness. Shortly after, this will become an oligarchy, leading to economic inequality. Eventually, the lower classes will rise up and create a democracy. Plato has very pessimistic views toward democracy, therefore he concludes the process by saying that eventually a tyrant will be elected and make the city a tyranny. Plato did also think that there was a way to turn a tyranny back to Callipolis. He thought that if the tyrant could be educated in the fields of philosophy, he would abandon his ways and become a philosopher king. He tried it plenty of times with King Dionysius of Syracuse by teaching him philosophy, but he had little success. He believes this because the tyrant is the unhappiest man of all, because he has limited freedom, because he must surround himself with bodyguards and is slave to his own power, which is sad if you think about it. You may think I've already said enough, but I purposely overlooked one very important thing: the difference between a sophist and a philosopher. To tell you the difference between them and how sophists helped Plato in writing his work, we have a guest. Giovanni Giorgini, professor of political doctrines, philosophy, and expert in Greek philosophy.
Well, one of, the ideas I'm especially interested in is Plato's debt towards the sophists. When you read a handbook, a textbook on ancient philosophy, or even an introduction to Plato, everybody points to Socrates' importance, Socrates' influence on Plato's thought, and I obviously fully agree on that. For some reasons, the sophist's role is very often taken only to be a negative role in Plato. Plato obviously wanted to react to the sophists, and the picture that emerges is very often the one that Plato wanted, meaning Socrates was the good guy and the sophists were the bad guys. Plato has surely confrontation with the sophists, but I believe he also learned a lot from the sophists. And the most important thing that Plato learned, in my opinion, was the importance of rhetoric. This is, in my view, showed by the treatment that the sophist Gorgias receives. Gorgias is treated as an elderly person, personally a good human being. Only his teachings, the fact that he's interested in persuasion and not in the search for the truth, is the problem. If you ask me for an example, maybe a terrible example of what I am pointing to, well, I think the trial and death of Socrates is the perfect demonstration that Socrates' method could arrive only to a certain point. I mean, you can be interested in the truth, but if you don't persuade your audience of the truth content of what you're saying, you are sentenced to death. So, in my opinion, Plato learned that. So, what Plato wants to do instead is to use a very nice expression, which is the title of a book of a colleague of mine, Franco Trabattoni, in Milan, Scrivere nell'anima, writing into the soul. This is what Plato wants to do with his interlocutors. He wants to write into their souls, meaning he wants to persuade them about the new truth he believes he has discovered. And the sophists were instrumental in showing Plato the importance of rhetoric. So this is one point that I believe is very often neglected by critics, the importance of speech, the importance of persuasion. And Gorgias was a great philosopher himself. I saw in your brief outline that you call Gorgias a philosopher. I think he fully deserves the name. Sophist was another way of saying a wise person in Greek. He was a sophist, obviously, he was a teacher of rhetoric, but he was also a philosopher. He was interested in the power that speech has on a human being. And he was the first to point to the fact that speech acts exactly like medicine acts on your body. Medicines have, drugs have a certain influence, a certain effect on your body, Likewise, speech has a certain influence, a certain effect on your soul. Where we find the famous sentence, speech is a powerful lord. With the smallest body, he accomplishes divine actions. Well, to put a long story short, in my view, any ordinary Athenian citizen in the 5th century would have had, or in the 4th century, would have had a hard time distinguishing someone like Socrates and Plato from Gorgias or Protagoras. The line between a sophist and a philosopher was very thin, in my opinion, or I would say non-existent. It is Plato who, with intellectual honesty, admits that the line is very thin, but for him is very important. And he's responsible for drawing this line to make it a hard and fast line. Because Plato, in all his works, wanted to distinguish what his former teacher Socrates was doing, pursuing the truth, from what the sophists were doing, winning the argument. For him, these were two completely different enterprises, completely different endeavors. I don't think that any ordinary Athenian would have seen the difference. And so, to answer your question, I don't think there are, the sophists were lesser philosophers. Maybe what you should consider is one or two cities in a contemporary Turkey in what was then called Ionia. These were considered Greek cities. I'm thinking of Miletus and Halicarnassus, for instance, the current Izmir. They are very interesting, very important, because for political reasons and also for cultural reasons. Herodotus came from Halicarnassus, for instance. Miletus was the origin of the Persian Wars. And don't forget, good night and good luck.
Thank you so much, Professor. I couldn't have asked for a better cameo. Originally I planned to also talk about Aristotle, who is just as interesting, but I think the video went on for a bit too long. I will definitely make a video about him sometime in the future. Let's conclude this video with a small reflection. The reason why I went through all this philosophy with you is because it can give us a very clear idea on how the ancient Greeks thought, lived, and saw the world around them. These are not just the texts of some random person, these are geniuses of their time, and many of their points not only stand the test of time, but most likely were shared with most Greeks at the time. Greek philosophy is at the basis of Western civilization, that's why I think it's important, and for that reason I wanted to share it with you. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you very soon. Have a good one, guys, and stay safe.